There you go.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the panel session on Voices of Climate Justice. Today, we would have fellow experts in the room, starting with Dr. Gaige Kerr, to Ms. Sanjana Paul, and then Dr. Mabel Baez-Schon. As you know, climate change impacts all of us, but not equally. And more importantly, it will certainly result in inequalities with and between nations, as well as present future and present generations a wide disparity. Climate justice has recently been used as the term to portray and advocate for global warming as an ethical and political concern rather than a solely environmental or fiscal one. According to the World Bank, by the time many of the teenage climate activists here today are in their late 20s, climate change would have forced about an additional 100 million people into extreme poverty. In addition, IFPRI also estimates that about 20% increase in malnourished children would be recorded compared to what we see without climate change today. Geospatial technology has been, one that has been at the forefront of, climate change tracking and monitoring. And today, over the next couple of minutes, our experts here today will talk about, what does an environmental just world look like, and what's the possibility of exploring it using, geospatial technology, especially from space, and more importantly, how do we stay energized on environmental justice issues and continue the current momentum. That said, and before we dive into the conversation, would like to have a quick round of introduction from the experts here today, starting with Dr. Gaige Kerr.
Hi, everyone, or the four of you here, and the people online. My name is Gaige Kerr. I'm a research scientist just up the street at George Washington University in the School of Public Health, specifically in the Environmental and Occupational Health Department. So I'll be talking about my work after introductions on air quality and health and environmental justice.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Dr. K. So over to you, Ms. Sanjana Paul.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here in person and online. So my name is Sanjana. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Earth Hacks, which is an environmental hackathon organization. We work with students and organizations all over the world to use hackathons as a form of climate action. And we try to do this with a focus on climate and environmental justice. So very excited to be here in great company.
Super. And to you, Dr. Baez.
Hello, my name is Mabel Baez-Schon, and I'm an interdisciplinary research scientist at the University of Florida, where my work concentrates on forest resources and conservation, and specifically on community-based forest research.
Okay, so over the next 7 minutes each of the panelists will be talking about, how far have we gone as far as the utilization of geospatial technology to monitor climate impact and climate burden. Are we seeing increasing adoption across the global south? And more importantly, but before that, let's start with, Voices of Climate Justice.
Thanks. I think one of the last in-person conferences I was at, I had an 8 a.m. session. It was in New Orleans, so similar kind of empty room vibes, but thank you all for being here today. Today I'm going to talk about a particular pollutant I study called nitrogen dioxide, or NO2 for short. There's a few facts you should know about NO2 before I get into how it's an environmental justice issue. The first fact about NO2 is that it's regulated by the EPA under the Clean Air Act. NO2 is also generally associated with traffic and industry. It's created through fossil fuel combustion. And finally, it has a host of health consequences associated with it. It creates adverse birth, respiratory, and cardiovascular outcomes, as well as growing evidence suggesting that it's related to premature mortality. So to kick off this brief few minutes I have with all of you about the injustices that NO2 exhibits, I want to take us to Detroit in the 1950s and 60s. The image that you see on the left is from a particular neighborhood in Detroit called Black Bottom. It was a predominantly African-American or Black neighborhood back in 1959 when this picture on the left was taken. And if you look closely, I don't know if you're able to see it from where you're sitting or online, but you can see there's people in the streets, there's businesses, there's cars. And just 2 years later, in 1961, it's hard to believe that that image on the right is taken from more or less the same vantage point. all those businesses, the people, they're gone. It's been replaced with a 4-lane highway and some frontage roads. Now, this type of urban planning is not unique to Detroit. If we look at the fabric of the American urban area across the country, we see similar stories that highways and interstates and other facilities that are associated with emissions of air pollutants were built around this time, and they often weren't built in wealthy white neighborhoods. They were often intentionally placed in marginalized, racialized, and minoritized neighborhoods. So it's this kind of story that I hope to underpin my research with as I speak to you about it today. Now, understanding the inequities that NO2 exhibits would not be possible just relying on the EPA's surface level monitors. Currently, the EPA has about 500 monitors scattered around the country, and that number might sound like a lot, but there's one other fact about NO2 that you should know, and it's that NO2 varies really substantially even within a given city. NO2 can vary drastically just from neighborhood to neighborhood. So hopefully that helps to contextualize why 500 monitors across the entire US isn't a lot. But we are at SatSummit right now, so you can probably guess where I'm going with this, that satellites can come to the rescue and help us understand NO2 better from space. The animation that you're seeing here shows the orbit, the polar orbit of one particular satellite that I use in my research. The satellite is the European Space Agency's Sentinel-5P satellite, and specifically the instrument that I'm using is an instrument called Tropomi, which measures nitrogen dioxide or NO2 from space at a really unprecedented resolution, a resolution that allows us to pick apart different NO2 levels from neighborhood to neighborhood within cities. So for the last couple minutes I have, before we turn things over to the other panelists, I want to just give us a taste of some of the work that I've been doing using the satellite data. And I should say we can use the satellite data as kind of a standalone product, or we can combine it with computer models, treating the satellite data as an input variable or predictor to improve the quality of our models. So one project I led took a look at how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted NO2 disparities. I think we all know that many people's cars stayed parked during the pandemic and lots of industries were shut down. So it was an open question how these changes in urban activity and changes in emissions would impact NO2 disparities. What we found is that the pandemic reduced but didn't eliminate NO2 disparities. And you can see that result if you take a look at the length of the solid bar, which shows the magnitude of disparities prior to the pandemic, and contrast it with the length of the dashed bar, which shows the disparities during the height of the 2020 COVID lockdowns and stay-at-home measures. So that's one finding from the study, and that's kind of an optimistic silver lining type of finding. But the other finding, if you look closely at these results, is that even during the pandemic, the NO2 or nitrogen dioxide levels in the least white communities of the US were still 2 times higher than the levels that the most white communities in the US enjoyed prior to the pandemic. I think that's a really important and stark finding, that even these unprecedented, once-in-a-lifetime changes in emissions and activity during the pandemic still resulted in communities of color, Black and brown communities, breathing in about 2 times the amount of NO2 than white communities experienced before the pandemic. I've also done some work to try to understand disparities in the health impacts related to NO2 more broadly, not just during the pandemic. What you're looking at in this picture are rates of pediatric asthma that we're able to attribute to NO2. And what you can see if you take a look at the different colored scatter points is that persistently for every year of our analysis, the least white communities across the US experience far higher rates of pediatric asthma due to NO2. I guess the one good thing that we can take from this picture is that these rates overall are declining. There's that negative slope to these scatter points. But the last thing I'll say before I begin to wrap things up today is that those reductions in NO2 concentrations and in the associated disease burdens have not been even. Not every community in the US has experienced an equal reduction in these variables. And the result of those uneven changes is that relative disparities are growing. And by relative disparities, I'm talking about the ratio, that disparity between asthma rates in the most and least white communities. And specifically what we found is that during this 10-year period that I examined in the last slide, the relative disparities in NO2 attributable asthma have grown by about 20% for different racial subgroups. And we find similar results for ethnic subgroups as well. So that's what I have to kick things off. I have contact information on the screen and looking forward to our discussion after this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Kerr. So we'll pass it on to Sanjana now. As the co-founder of EarthHack, it'll be good to get your views on climate justice. What does an environmental just world look like?
Definitely. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start by kind of framing a little bit the work that we do at EarthHacks and why we're even talking about hackathons in the context of climate justice and why this is important. So at EarthHacks, like I mentioned, we're an environmental hackathon organization, and this means a lot of different things. So EarthHacks works with students, organizations from all over the world. We host environmental hackathons focusing on innovative, equitable, and just projects in response to the climate crisis. We do both in-person and, are my slides gone? They're back. We do both in-person and virtual hackathons, which was actually started by the global COVID-19 pandemic. But we've also worked with and created a ton of different hackathons, ranging from teaming up with traditional computer science-oriented hackathons, like some of the ones you see in the picture here, to working with indigenous leaders on geospatial storytelling tools, to creating tools for wildlife conservation, to reimagining the Sustainable Development Goals, and kind of encouraging students to try and understand what they can actually do when they're empowered and when they're enabled to be in spaces where they can exchange these ideas. So now that you know what we do as EarthHacks, why exactly do we do this? As this very elegant diagram that was created by a student at one of our last in-person hackathon shows, because of climate change. It's both bad and not good. It's perhaps the most important challenge of our time, because if we don't figure out climate change and how we are going to both address the root causes as well as make sure that everyone is able to survive and hopefully thrive in a climate change world, what hope do we have of addressing any of the other global challenges we face? So while a single hackathon might not single-handedly completely save the planet, hackathons can be very powerful tools for climate action, and that's what we really hope to be able to harness them as. We feel that they're interdisciplinary, democratic environments. They have an educational focus. They're positive spaces for people to explore new ideas that they might have felt shy doing so otherwise. They bring together access to resources for participants, and so much more. The real question is, why not hackathons? But we have to apply hackathons and the projects that come out of them carefully. We have to be cognizant that there's not really any one silver bullet solution to the climate crisis. A single technology cannot solve the climate crisis. And while technology is certainly a necessary and very important part of the action that globally and locally we need to take, governance, public participation, cultural practices, and more are equally important to focus on and invest time and resources in. And it's important to present those ideas specifically to STEM students who might not be exposed to those concepts in their curriculums. We also have to take a thoughtful approach that centers responsible innovation and environmental justice when it comes to climate innovation, so that we don't replicate the same power structures that led to climate change and a lot of the negative effects that people are feeling in the first place. So what do these terms mean, and how do we define them to our students who might not ever have encountered them before? How can we apply them to technology so that we use tech and data responsibly, both at hackathons and elsewhere? Responsible innovation has a lot of different definitions. It's kind of a nebulous term that can be used in different contexts, but this is one of the most common ones that we present to our students, which is from Dr. Ridwan Sorunke from the European Commission. So responsible research and innovation is a transparent, interactive process by which societal actors and innovators become mutually responsive to each other with a view to the ethical acceptability, sustainability, and societal desirability of the innovation process. And I'll stop there because it's a long definition. And environmental justice. Environmental justice can really vary in its definition and scope depending on where in the world you are, but we use the definition by Dr. Robert Bullard, who's commonly considered the father of environmental justice in the United States. Dr. Bullard says that all people are entitled to equal environmental protection regardless of race, color, or national origin. It's the right to live and work and play in a clean environment. So when we present these concepts as tech practitioners, how do we actually apply them? And so we encourage our students to ask difficult, sometimes uncomfortable questions, like who actually gets to be an innovator? Who gets to decide what environmentally just technology and responsible innovation are, and what communities use these concepts? Who gets to decide what technologies are worth pursuing, and when they go too far, and when the line is crossed of doing more harm than good? Who bears the cost of innovation? Whose human rights are violated when we pursue the creation of new technologies? And who do these technologies help and harm? How can tech enable false progress, like greenwashing, or the rediscovery of existing solutions that have been put forward by communities already, or enable other harmful false solutions that don't actually push us in the direction of progress? So there really is no single answer to any of these questions. They're going to vary according to local contexts and cultures. So it's up to all of us as tech practitioners, especially when we're working with the next generation of scientists and engineers, to build up a good set of examples to look to. We have to apply tech, data, practices like hackathons to environmental challenges given our global situation, but we have to do so in a way that we do more good than harm. We need to do things like decommission coal plants and develop zero-emission ways to keep people's homes powered, and we need to do that in a way that doesn't cause further environmental destruction through poor mining practices, for example. We need to work together to discover new ways of living, which might sometimes mean a return to traditional ways of living, like eating locally or seasonally. We have to do a lot. And we have to understand that we can take these actions collectively, which is a philosophy that we try and apply through our hackathon programs. So these are some of the topics and themes that EarthHacks explores in our new project, Environmental Justice in Tech, which you can find online at environmentaljustice.tech. We tried to keep it simple. We put together a series of creative educational resources for our students and for people all over the world to learn about and engage with the intersection of environmental justice concepts and technology applications. We very much see our current work as a first step, because this is a very, very initial sort of blooming space that's really wonderful to see momentum around. And we really hope to continue to interface with the global community to push this work forward. So I think I'll wrap up here with a brief overview of kind of what we do at environmental hackathons, how we frame our philosophy, and how environmental hackathons and technology can work in service of environmental justice instead of hindering it. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Mabel.
Super. Thank you so much, Sanjana, and really good to hear how you talk about the fact that there's no silver bullet and the need to be thoughtful as we approach these tech-led solutions. So I think to move a bit, I would turn it to Dr. Baez-Schon to talk about our views on climate justice. What does an environmental just world look like?
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. And I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I am an interdisciplinary research scientist, and I worked in forest resources and conservation, specifically community-based forest management, right? So what is community-based forest management? Community-based forest management is when local communities have some or all responsibilities for the day-to-day management of their forest and their forest resources. And this is really important because normally when I do like a thought activity with my friends and family who don't know very much what I do, I ask them, okay, so what do you think about when I say the words tropical forests? And normally when people think about tropical forests, they never think about the individuals living there. So the idea of community-based forest management really tries to elucidate the connections between the forests and the local community members that live in the forests or live near it, right, and use it. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the work that I do. Nothing in my mind elucidates the relationship between people and forests as much as sacred forests. Now, sacred forests are a form of community forest management, and they're protected because of the religious and spiritual values that they hold to local communities, indigenous peoples, or other forms of the guardians, local guardians. And normally, these are spaces that are very variable in the ways that are used, the ways that the people conceptualize them, what they mean to people. But generally, they have high levels of biodiversity and low levels of deforestation. And this is because they're maintained through some of the cultural norms, taboos, and sanctions specific to the sacred forests. And, here I have a photo on the left of one of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church forests that I worked in Ethiopia. And you can see in this particular landscape that it's the only forest in the landscape, right? And it's really important in terms of the cultural, religious, and sometimes it even has economic uses as well. And how effective can these local institutions and local communities be at maintaining some of these forested ecosystems? They have historically done so, right? And so I love sharing this photo. Well, I don't know if love is really the correct word, but I think it really shows what I mean when I say that local communities are really important for maintaining these ecosystems. So this is a satellite imagery of the Sadi region. And if you have to squint to see where the forests are, that's because that's really the reality of it, right? We even encircled it in yellow so that we can really highlight them. And you can see what it looks like on the left side, and that's one of our drone images that we took while in the field. And in the middle, we have a church, and the forest acts as a protection to the church and its sacred contents. This is really important because it sort of flips the narrative of, often when we think of forests, we think that forests are there despite people. But really, what research shows and what I think is that forests are there because of people. And so I just wanted to give just one example of how some of these geospatial technologies can help highlight the roles that local communities have in this. So in Ethiopia, there is a contested but rhetoric that in the last century, there was a 40% reduction in forest cover. And the idea was that it was driven by local deforestation for the expansion of agricultural fields, right? And so when you think about that rhetoric is really important when we think about what are the mitigation strategies, what are the policies that we need to create in order to address those problems, right? So for our team, we were able to get aerial photographs taken during the Italian occupation of Ethiopia in the 1930s and 40s, and we were able to compare what was happening on the landscape in modern times. And what we found was that not only did our sacred forests not decrease in size during that time, but actually some of them grew, right? And so that really changes the way we think about things because it really shows that local communities need to be part of the discussion when talking about what to do in these circumstances. So, you guys might be wondering, okay, what does that have to do exactly with climate justice? So, we already know that climate change both reflects and exacerbates inequalities, right? And the idea of a climate justice approach to solving the climate crisis requires that the very people that are disproportionately affected, that these people are part of the solution, that they're in the rooms having these conversations about what the causes are for the problem, what the solutions look like, because otherwise we run the risk that our solutions are part of the problem, right? And so over the last 10 years, I've been doing field work in places like Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Brazil, etc. And I've been really passionate about, okay, so we know that we have to involve the local community members, indigenous people, disenfranchised communities, etc. And I'm really passionate about, okay, so what does that look like when we're doing the actual research on the ground? What are the things that we need to consider when we're working there? And yeah, so I'll just leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Dr. Baez-Schon. Really exciting. And I think that this slide, says it all, right? We need to give thanks to the respected priests, monks, and community members who gave us access to their sacred forest. And I think it's just really interesting, to hear that, climate protection is really happening, within the sacred forest. And probably, a recommendation could be a case of, how can we advocate for the extension of sacred forest, right? And probably keep more places green. I think, we will transition to the questions, and really exciting to hear from the panelists here today on their initial view as far as climate justice is concerned. That said, I'm going to start with you, Mabel, and to take it from where you stopped, right? Connecting the community with the forest. But now, let's zoom in a bit on, geospatial tech and satellite imagery. And it's a question of, we're seeing increasing voices globally on climate justice, and more increasingly across the global south, believing that, why should they pay when they contribute less to the global climate burden, right? And the kind of work you've done has, shown, the disparities, that shown, what kind of work has been done, by the local stakeholders. But in reality, is satellite imagery and geospatial technology triggering local actions? And, are there particular examples that you can point to?
Yes, thank you. So I feel like first, when I think about that question, the first thing that comes to mind is so local community members, indigenous peoples, marginalized and disenfranchised communities have done the hard work historically, right? They have been fighting for this for decades. I think what's changing is how we're listening to it and how that is coming out there. So one way that I'm really, really happy to see that geospatial technology can help in this process is that it literally puts people on the map. And not only does it literally put people on the map, but through digital mapping and digital storytelling, like you were discussing earlier, literally communities are able to take a GPS and, record when there's trespassing in their territory, when there's deforestation in their territory, when there's human rights violations, right? Because the climate justice approach, it requires that we think about all the different ways in which social, environmental, and racial injustices are all connected to the climate crisis. What we see more is that because a lot of these communities and these individuals are not part of the discussions, they're not in the rooms where the policies are being made, using geospatial technology that raises their voice, right? So like as an ally, not that we're, we have to be careful not to have like the savior complex in some ways. We have to really allow them, just lift their voices rather and being allies. They're really telling their stories with their voice, and I think that's a really exciting way in which geospatial technologies are being used by community members on the ground. And what that does is that it takes, individual actions that are happening and sort of brings it together. And I think that's really exciting for going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Super exciting to see that, local action is being triggered, using geospatial technology and evidences and insights from satellite imagery. Transitioning to that, I'm going to ask, Sanjana the question around, how can we sustain the momentum of climate justice, actions from evidences and insights from satellite imagery and geospatial tech. And, I think that kind of connects to what Mabel talked about these current actions on the ground. And if so, are there key learnings that we can adopt from the work you're doing at ETAX?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So I think Mabel really hit it on the head that we really just have to elevate what people are doing already, because I think an assumption that's sometimes made from the standpoint of scientists and technologists in the global north is that, we have to step in and we have to do this work. We can step in and lend support when communities ask for it, and that enables these really wonderful international, intergeneration, bonds that are formed, which is really important. But I think that looking at just the amount of incredible work for environmental preservation, for human rights, and everything that's already being led by local groups in the Global South, it's really kind of a matter of amplifying and elevating that. And to your question specifically, Ridwan, about looking at the momentum that is really starting to build in the geospatial space as a whole around climate justice and how powerful a geospatial technology is as a tool for storytelling around these things and how powerful it is as educational tools for these things. If you literally show people a map, for example, I know a really big thing in like the university geospatial world for a little while was looking at overlaying air pollution in cities with historical redlining in the United States. And you could see the effects of racism on people's health today. So that's very powerful, and we definitely need to continue to find applications for that. I would argue that we also need to kind of think about a little bit of a framing shift or a cultural shift in kind of the tech space, from moving from, tech for good and environmental justice applications as kind of a special interest to really primary principle of why we do this work, and really understanding that that framing has to be centered in the context of where we are with climate change in the 21st century. To the point about Earth hacks, I think it's less of a question of what can we learn from Earth hacks and more what we can all learn from each other, because I think that, collaboration, not competition, is very key when it comes to environmental issues. We can't be competing against each other for who has the cleanest air, although it might be nice to have a competition to see which city can get their air to be the cleanest. So thinking about how to center collaborative approaches in a lot of these applications is, I think, also really, really important, is showing scientists and technologists that there's a huge amount of value in local knowledge and learning from frontline communities who have a very intimate understanding of the problem and very likely the solution, and the necessity of these cross-functional approaches in actually meaningfully solving any sort of climate justice challenge.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sanjana. It's really important to hear that, we must learn from each other, right? And that said, I think I would transition a bit to Gaige, and in terms of, the presentation you had given earlier, that looked at, nitrous oxide and, how there's a disparity between, communities in the US. And I think to you, would like to get a sense of, how we can use spatial technology to actually bridge the divide, right? Or to bridge the gap and, close the disparity as far as, environmental pollution is concerned, and as well as also, the accompanying health impact.
Thanks for that question. I think my response is going to build on what you two have already laid out, and it's something I have to remind myself of when I'm conducting this work, that I try to view myself as a bridge between local communities and folks who can affect change through their power, through politics. When I show some of my research results and say, I found this result, I have to remind myself that I didn't really find it in the same way, Columbus didn't find America. You could go to these communities that we're able to see from space, and they've known for decades, for a really long time, that they're on the front lines, they're fence line communities. So they knew this already, but I think we all know that people in power like their data, they like their feasibility assessments and mounds of reports, rather than maybe listening to that concerned citizen. So I try to view myself and the geospatial technology that I use in that light, that I'm providing quantitative evidence that kind of complements lived experiences, and hopefully those two things in tandem can be used to affect change for the better and close that divide, like you said.
Yeah, and then still staying on you, right? Would want to drill deeper a bit in terms of, the recent advancements or the trends that you see in spatial technology that's being used and is playing a key role in the exploration of the global inequality as far as the pollution distribution is concerned. And maybe you can just touch a bit on the global south.
Yeah, sure. Is this working, by the way? The mic? Yeah, okay, great. So I think one thing that is powerful when it comes to the instruments that I use in my work is their spatial resolution. And after being here for a day and a half now, I'm realizing that this remote sensing of trace gas world is quite a bit behind the optical imagery world. I hear people talking about sub-meter resolution. We're really happy with these instruments that we can get to kilometer resolution, but that might sound coarse to all of you, and I guess at some level it is, but even just having that information allows us to drill down into particular neighborhoods. And I think more than just documenting that disparities exist, which I think we all know before you came to this session or before you read any papers, we can start to connect the satellite data with other information about urban activity and emissions, and combining those data together can help us drill down what's causing the disparities, both in the US and abroad. And I think that's really powerful. I didn't have time to talk about it in my slides, but some of my work has pointed the finger at heavy duty trucking and the impacts that it has on nitrogen dioxide disparities. So I think making those kind of very deliberate connections with specific industries that one could design actionable policy around can be used to advance environmental justice, both domestically and abroad.
Yeah, thanks very much. And you did talk about recent trends and advancement in technology, right? And as we talk about climate justice, I mean, we're talking about inequalities, right? We're talking about impact across board. But that said, as we think about the impact, we also need to think about the technology, right? So, and the disparity between the technology in the global north and the global south. So to Sanjana, I think the question really is in terms of how can we drive local capacity as far as technology is concerned in a bid to solve, climate inequality down there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there's a lot of layers to it. And I mean, the first is just that, yes, we have to close that digital divide. If people are going to have access to the internet and this massive network of collaboration, keeping people off of that is just doing a disservice. And it's a disparity that needs to instantly be addressed. I think, again, it's a question of framing and of what is important to the tech community. And, it's really great to see advances in technology. And it's really interesting to push the bounds of what we as a species can do. But you also have to consider, again, why are we doing this? Why are we maybe investing a little bit more into AR for immersive experiences in the global north instead of making sure that our colleagues in the global south have access to the same tools that we do? Why are some things more of a priority than others? So shifting that framing, because we absolutely do have the resources to do so and to ensure that all of the brilliant people who are working on these issues in the global south are able to kind of get on the same access to the same infrastructure as we do. And then the second thing is, I think, really investing in young people. One, because young people are going to be the ones who are going to have to live in a climate change world and who are going to have to adapt and mitigate and think of really creative ways to kind of understand how they can have good lives. And also because of the immense amount of energy and talent. We're so blown away when we have Earth Hacks hackathons and we're doing these virtual events and we're like looking at Slack channels and being like, hey guys, what's up? Are you okay? Do you need anything? And there's this team from like Paraguay and Tanzania and Berlin, like, yeah, we're fine. Don't actually bother us. We're working. We're really busy, And so like really seeing the amount of energy and talent and drive that there is all over the world. And again, asking ourselves what's important. Who gets to be an innovator? Is it, the kids who have access to a bunch of hackathons that they can go to at their local university? Of course they're important. But equally important are the kids in the global south who are juggling taking care of their grandparents with 2 jobs and school and trying to figure out how to write Python and trying to understand how they can get garbage disposal in their area better. So we really have to, I think, ask ourselves those framing questions and just where are we putting our resources, time, and energy, and what should we as a tech community really be investing our resources into? And I think if we answer that question in the right way, we'll absolutely be able to see this flood of intelligence and talent and drive from the global south really enter the global stage.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sanjana. And I think that's very correct because a part of the statistics that we have talked about earlier talked about the fact that by the time this set of climate change activists get into their 20s, climate change could have triggered additional 100 million people in poverty. That said, I'm still going to stay on the same question and to Dr. Baez-Schon. Really in terms of not just capacity now, but I want to go one step further. Ownership. How can we drive, local capacity, but also local ownership of geospatial technology to solve, climate inequalities down there?
Okay, that's a good question. I'm going to start with saying that it starts with building relationships. It starts with building relationships with the community of users, right? It starts with building relationships with the people that we're doing research right, sometimes on, right? Like we're doing research from above, right? It starts with building relationships. And that's so important because, to back up, part of I want to say a little bit about like how I got to here and thinking about this in some ways. When I first started doing research in 2013 in Costa Rica, I was just looking at the impact of climate change, and I was only looking at, the impact of human activity on the forest, and it just felt really like, there wasn't that connection to like solutions, thinking about what are the causes of all these things, and subsequently, I started looking at human dimensions. And part of doing research, I think that's really important, is that you have to do that. And that got me to this idea of participatory action research. So what is that? Participatory action research basically is that the people that we're doing research, that our research is going to impact, or even in the spaces that we're doing research in, should not just be participants or even subjects. They should be part of the research process. And this idea really is meant to democratize the entire research process. And so the idea is, the community, when you make those relationships, they're part of what questions get asked. They're part of how things are, what data is collected and how. And the idea then is that through this process, there's going to be greater ownership of whatever is the result, because it is by the community, for the community. It's something that they're interested in, that they actually want these questions to be asked. And, and also through this process, there is capacity building, right? And this is also a transformative process, not only for the community that you work with, but also for yourself as a researcher, right? And I think it's also really important for us to think about that and how to conduct that sort of relationship building in an ethical manner, right? Because normally we're taught the technical side of things, right? It's very rare that we're also taught how to create those relationships in an ethical manner, right? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean that's really important, and you talked about relationship building being the cornerstone of local ownership.
Yes.
But while that is correct, I also want to go a step further. And for everyone, I've been going steps further, but we're just trying to get to the solution, right? And to answer the questions of today. But a step further is also looking at the trend, right, in the relationship between the global researchers, people like yourself, and the local owners. I mean, for your PhD project, you had looked at Ethiopia and then in Latin America. Mm-hmm. What's the trend, in the relationship between the global researchers in satellite technology and the local owners and communities? And, do you want to talk from the point of view of LATAM and Africa?
Yes, that is I like how you keep going further. So what is the trend? The trend is still very much, so first, I would like to say that this is changing, right? But the trend is very much still that we have a question that we create, using theory. And after doing all the readings that we've been doing, namely from knowledge created in the global north, and we go to these spaces and we already have our methods set, right? And we collect our data, sometimes with local community members being participants, and then that's it. That's like where it stops. The rest of the journey happens in, elsewhere. It's writing a paper. And then normally that paper, this is changing a little bit more, but like normally that paper is even, you have to pay for it. And so that's very extractive, right? The ownership then is here. It's very colonializing. And I think that is unfortunately still the predominant trend of how the relationship happens between the researchers and what's happening on the communities. And so that's why, I keep talking about these participatory methods that are really important for changing how that dynamic occurs, right? And so you mentioned that I did research in both Ethiopia and then Latin America. So how does that look like, right? this participatory sort of research methods. And so, in Ethiopia, when we were doing research largely, so I don't know Amharic, right? I tried really hard to learn Amharic while I was living there. It is extremely hard language, and I did my best. But so often, the people that I was working with most, I did go into these communities, but the people that I was working with most were students in the universities in Ethiopia and researchers in the Ethiopian universities, right? For my dissertation, we were working in Brazil, and I really wanted to make these connections. I wanted to walk the walk and talk the talk. Sorry, sometimes these American idioms, I switch them around. And so I learned Portuguese. And I built it into my research scheme that I was going to go back into these communities like multiple times, right? And that through that relationship building, I was hoping to create a question that was something that people were interested in and that they could use. And oftentimes that also meant that it wasn't just me taking the data for my own research, but actually me asking the local community members or local partners in the universities or the NGOs, what do they need and what can I provide for them? So what did that look like? Once they needed, one of the local NGOs, they needed someone to do butterfly surveys. I know nothing about butterflies, but I showed up and I did. I help with the butterfly surveys. So that sort of relationship building takes time. It takes effort. It's a little bit sort of like messy in many ways, but it's really important to do that. And I think that for me, I was really lucky too that at UF, at the University of Florida, there's this program, the Tropical Conservation and Development Program. And that program, one of the aims is to provide some of these skills for researchers to go in and do this in a more ethical manner and a more thorough manner, right? So facilitation, conflict management, communication. These are all skills that are necessary to do this in an ethical manner.
Excellent. I mean, that's excellent. Three things I had. The relationship takes time. It's messy, and you just need to stay on it, right? That said, I'm going to go back to Sanjana and still staying on the topic of climate justice, right? And we're going to go a bit further, right? In terms of, you have talked about local capacity. You have talked about, training the young generation. We've talked about the hackathons, which, you do at ETHACS. And as we look at, climate justice and we look at the impact of satellite imagery and geospatial technology, capacity is extremely important. But beyond that, translation of the capacity of the local ownership of geospatial technology into action becomes more important. Is local capacity in geospatial technology translating to increased actions by policymakers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's actually the standard answer to questions like that is really depends, because like some municipalities, some cities, some towns, some community organizations are aware of the vast amount of data that's out there and the vast amount of resources that are out there, and they're trying to take full advantage of it in whatever way they can. And some aren't. And that's a variety of reasons. That might be capacity on their end, because if you think about it, global north, global south, how many frontline organizations have a chief data officer or have a data scientist working with them full time? Do they have time to do that? Or are they busy taking water to people and making sure that elderly people have food? So sometimes it's a question of capacity. Sometimes I think it's a question of belonging and inclusion, right? Is that, are these resources accessible in every sense of the word? Are they in different languages, first of all, right? We're all on this panel speaking English, but, some, like most of the world speaks at least a few other languages, maybe. So are those resources available in, culturally responsive and culturally appropriate ways? Are they also presented in an accessible way? Because in the research community, we tend to like our jargon, like our terminology, we like our acronyms, but maybe other people don't because they don't really understand how or why we're engaging with these basic things so formally. So I think it's kind of a question of looking at those things and understanding what's the capacity, what's the access to these resources, and are these frontline organizations or these cities, municipalities equipped to actually take advantage of it? And then you have to try and understand, are there policy blockers? Is there a particularly strong faction of conservative oil and gas lobbying that's happening somewhere that is trying to stop, building electrification or something like that? Is it just kind of a lack of awareness of how powerful these actions can be? And so again, then it's this question of this multidisciplinary approach centering sort of, giving other people who are in these positions the capacity and the stage, and we just have the supporting role as people who have had access to these things. So yeah, I think you asked a very important question. I think my very vague answer is it depends.
Yeah. Super, excellent. So it depends. Yeah. Now back, and this is going to be the last question before I throw it open to the audience. So if you have questions, please prepare the questions. We want to continue to drive deeper into the conversation in a bit to answer the question. What does an environmental just world look like, and how can geospatial technology help achieve this? Now the final question to Gaige. And it's in terms of, I'm not going to go a bit deeper, okay, but I'm just going to come, back again, right? Just kind of have that conversation in terms of, what health observation linked solution can help close the gap when it comes to air pollution exposure. And more importantly, let's stay on the global north and let's stay in the US, right? What role do social background and social economic status play in that health observation linked solution?
And just to clarify, when you talk about socioeconomic status, you're talking about that as an independent identity from race and ethnicity?
Yes.
Okay. It's something that folks in my world of air quality and EJ have pointed out, unfortunately, is that it kind of doesn't matter how much money you make. If you're black versus white, that dictates a lot of your exposure. There's an analysis I'm thinking of done by again, other people in this space that have found that black and brown communities are overexposed to pollution, regardless of if you control for income. And at every income level, these communities still find themselves, experiencing higher levels of pollution, higher burdens of disease, despite being, a wealthy black person compared to a white community that might even have, less money or have a lower poverty rate. So when I think about these disparities, I think more about race and ethnicity and some of the underlying factors driving those disparities. You mentioned redlining. There's, of course, other deliberate racist decisions that were made, as part of urban planning that have kind of cemented or baked these inequalities into our cities, into our country. So I know that probably doesn't answer the socioeconomic part directly, but I think focusing solely on income and thinking of race as kind of a proxy for income is not the most effective way to go about thinking about these disparities or addressing them. We should flip that question around and think about race and ethnicity and the kinds of decisions that got us to basically racist air.
Excellent. This has been an interesting panel. I think, we've gotten a lot of questions, even though, I would have loved to continue to deep further. We have just a few minutes to round this conversation. So I would pass it on to the audience, both those here present physically as well as those online, for questions. So if you have a question, please signify by raising your hand and we'll call on you. Okay, sir. I'll start with an introduction. Yeah.
I hope you can hear me. My name is Ashutosh from microphone.com. My name is Ashutosh Lumay. My name is Ashutosh Lumay. I work for Superior NASA. So fantastic presentation, 3 different perspectives. I just have one question. How do you, so we have this example in Tanzania and Central America, South America. How do you scale? So these are approaches that have direct communication, direct contact with the folks on the ground. How do you hope to scale this? And who needs to be involved in making it to scale?
Okay, thank you very much. So I think, thank you for—
That can apply to all 3 of them.
Super, and thank you for, I think we're driving a bit deeper, right? So how do you scale? Looking at, this case study in Africa and in Latin America. How do you scale and who do you need to scale? Do you want to start, Dr. Baez-Schon?
Oh man, this is a good question. And it's something that I actually ask myself all the time, right? Because when you're looking and you're working at the local context, every time that you work in a different community, like you have to change the way you work to, fit the context, right? Otherwise, it just doesn't really work. I think that a way to scale that is through education, right? And changing the way we do things. And here, this is a really powerful, I think, place to be, because this is where a lot of companies and a lot of this big stuff happens, right? So yesterday, actually, I was hearing a lot about, I've been hearing throughout this conference about relationship making, right? And so it's already in the back of people's minds. And I think that you scaled it up by sort of bringing awareness to this through events like this, for example. At least for me, that's one of the biggest ways. And then making things available, like the hackathons, right? The educational components are really important, because it's just bringing people's awareness to this so that we can start thinking about it as we do our work and our research.
Excellent. To Sanjana, how do we scale, and what do you need to scale?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And again, standard answer is it depends. Because I think that Mabel really hit it on the head, right? Because when you work with different communities, you have to adopt a different cultural context, and you have to defer to the local knowledge that kind of is going to guide you in dealing with the situation. So it's probably thinking about some sort of a scalable framework that's very general that you can present as a starting point, and taking that philosophy to different areas. Who you need involved, most importantly, is the local communities, because you can't and you should not be doing anything, that's just kind of parachute science, which is a really great term to describe these practices that was coined by Dr. Asha DeVos, who's a Sri Lankan marine biologist and is like so cool. So I think that who you need primarily, it's local buy-in, right? And it's a local need first, is that, you can't necessarily project, I want to do this hackathon or this project and I want to do it with you guys. If they say, no, we're not interested, then you're not going to do it. And then you kind of need the resources in order to enable them. Right. So a lot of times it's financing, right? Because a lot of times, unfortunately, these communities have been left out of spaces that have access to a lot of capital. It's time. Right? You might just need people who have the skills to commit 6 months and just support. And then it's also kind of like the capacity to look a little bit beyond the constraints of the spaces that we're in right now, right? Why can't we have environmental justice be a primary focus of technological development? Like, what's up with that? Why is all tech not focusing on having a livable world for everyone? So I think that, like, to summarize, it's local buy-in, it's resources like financing and time, and then it's like the courage of imagination.
Excellent. So to Gaige, how do you scale, and what do you need to scale?
I think I'm going to take this a different way than you intended, but instead of thinking about scaling up, I'm going to think about scaling down, because what I presented on today is the kind of work I enjoy, which is kind of national level or even global analyses. But even though I've shown this consistent story that certain types of communities, certain population groups are overexposed on a national level, the solutions, how to fix that, certainly isn't a one-size-fits-all type of solution. That's going to depend where you are, what the politics are, what attitudes are. So we've been doing some liaisons with folks who have boots on the ground. For example, we've been talking with people who work in Houston, thinking specifically how the Houston ship channel, the petrochemical facilities, how they impact disparities. We've been talking to people on the ground in the south coast of California, where there's been this explosion of warehousing and e-commerce, thinking about how those facilities and the associated traffic contribute to pollution and disparities. So yeah, we're trying to liaise more with community groups, people that have experience on the ground, and try to scale these national level results down to local levels.
Excellent. Do we have any other question? Okay, so to round this up, I would ask one last question, right? And just taking us back to the beginning, right? How does or what does an environmental just world look like? And we'll give you 1 minute each to respond, or less to respond. What does an environmental just world look like to you? And then to start with, Gaige.
I was hoping you'd go with me last. I think that the answer I'm going to just default to is unique to my area. I want all of us to breathe clean air. It's not just breathing equally polluted air. That might be how you look at it with the glass half empty. It's a matter of combusting less things, burning less things, and getting us to a level where it doesn't matter what zip code you were born in, you're breathing similar, hopefully low levels of air pollution. And beyond just the levels we're breathing in, everyone needs to have a voice at the table. when it comes to devising solutions to get to that cleaner world, and when it comes to implementing those potential ideas. Everyone needs to be involved and make sure that the solutions kind of jive with different lifestyles, different lived experiences, ways that we go about our life.
Super. To Sanjana, what does an environmental just world look like?
I mean, I think that's really the defining question of the 21st century, right? So it's going to be challenging to answer it in a minute. But I mean, I think that's what we all have to kind of dedicate our time to working on, right? Is that we are facing climate impacts now. Right now, like just a little bit down south, what is happening in Florida right now, right? Climate change is here. So how are we going to simultaneously continue to try and stop the root causes of climate change in a way that acknowledges and centers all of the harm that's been done disproportionately to some parts of the world and some communities? How are we going to mitigate, existing effects that people are already feeling, prioritizing the communities that are most affected? And how are we going to do this in a way that actually inspires joy and makes people want to work towards an environmentally just world, right? How can we lift up these things of like really, really basic concepts like having clean air, having food, having drinkable water, having housing? These shouldn't be difficult things if we're able to kind of look at like kilometer resolution scale of different factors from space, right? So yeah, I think that I'll go back to what I said initially. It's a defining question of the 21st century. And so I hope that everyone in this room and everyone online kind of dedicates a lot of time to trying to figure out an answer to that.
Thank you. And finally, to Mabel, what does it look like?
Oh my gosh, like I don't know even what to follow up to that. I completely agree to what has been said. I think just to add a little bit my 2 cents, I think that we already know that climate change is happening and it's disproportional. I think that in my mind, an environmental just world means that when we look at things like race, religion, ethnicity, etc., when we look at how that doesn't, in my mind, in an ideal world, right, that doesn't define how the tools that you have for mitigation, the tools that you have for adaptation, that doesn't define, how whether or not you bear the brunt of pollution, right, that doesn't exist anymore. But I completely agree. This is what we're all here asking ourselves every day, and that we should continue to ask ourselves every day.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the session. Today we've covered voices of climate justice. We've asked the question, what does environmental just world look like? We've asked the question, can we see it from space? And I think, our 3 panelists have given an example of seeing, climate inequality from space. And we've also touched on, how this geospatial technology at a global level can be applied at a local level. And I think the key insights coming from that will be local capacity building, local ownership, and ways to scale it up, right? Not one size fits all. There is no silver bullet. Thank you once again for taking the time out of your extremely busy schedule to join this panel. I hope it's been a wonderful one for you. Thank you very much once again to the panelists who have also, dug deep as I asked deeper question. Wishing you the best of the day. Thank you.
Oh.